Hello, my name is Jeffrey Canton, and I'm here to talk to you about M.T. Anderson's remarkable novel, Feed, published in 2002 by Candlewick Press. In rereading Feed for this class, I have to say that my reaction to it is very different than it would have been even when I taught the novel 7 or 8 years ago, because the digital world that young people have access to has shifted so much. At the heart of that novel is a digital culture that is primarily focused on consumerism. And the young people, everyone who has the feed implanted, receives all of this information, a constant barrage of information that they can't shut out, that helps them, supposedly, to see the products that they would purchase. Supposedly, according to Titus in the chapter Missing the Feed was created in order to rethink how young people are educated. But from the beginning, that feed was controlled by corporate entities. And while I'm not suggesting that corporate entities don't play an enormous part in digital culture currently, I think there is room for resistance that is not there in Anderson's novel. At the heart of Feed is Violet's project to do something to disrupt the feed, to contest the way that she interacts with the feed, to make it impossible for the feed to get a handle on her. And as you know, having read the novel, that backfires terribly when the hacker damages Violet's feed, and towards the end of the book, when her request, the request that she and her father make to FeedQuest to repair her feed, is turned down because the sponsors say they don't know what she's looking for. That's an interesting thing to think about. What is the feed about? So let's think about that for a minute. Let's see in the novel how we interact with the feed. Although, as I said, consumerism is the mainstay of the feed, we do get bits and pieces of news, and we learn about how the America in Feed is falling apart. I think it's quite remarkable to think about the parallels between the President Trumbull in this novel and President Trump in the United States. But one of the things that is interesting to me is how all of that information is conveyed to us in bits and pieces. We learn, for example, that the United States has annexed the moon. As a result of that annexation, the Global Alliance begins to wage war, put on strictures on the United States. We're not entirely sure. We know from the bits and pieces we get from the feed as well that environmentally, the United States is in trouble. Not just the United States, the entire world, but in particular, the United States. And at the end of the novel, we have some really terrible things that we're hearing from Titus about how the environment is affecting the American people. But can they resist? Is there a way for them to resist? What are the mechanisms for resistance? And most importantly, how can people be heard? Because if young people are resisting the feed and making their voices heard, what are the channels available to them? In this novel, I don't really see any viable channels. And that is very different from the reality of the digital world that we actually live in. If you think about, for example, what has happened in the last 2 weeks, where the President of the United States is trying to ban TikTok because young people are being urged to contest his presidency, that couldn't happen in M.T. Anderson's novel. And the question that I ask myself as I was reading this novel is, why not? Well, you know, one of the things that I think is so interesting is that the feed in this novel was created in a very different way from the kind of technological world that we see, the cultural world that we see, with Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, among many other kinds of digital cultural sites that allow young people to reshape the world, because they cannot do that in M.T. Anderson's novel. Although it is very noteworthy that Violet tries to contest the feed, ultimately she has to admit defeat when, even as she is dying and trying to look at death anthems, the feed has figured her out. But then again, the feed isn't interested in individuals. The feed is interested in the lowest common denominator. And one of the things that Violet points out is that corporate culture is trying to make what people want smaller and smaller so that everyone wants the same thing. Let's think about that. Let's think about the fact that ultimately, even when these young people are buying shoes or shirts or what have you, their choices are so limited. And what they have, what the corporations offer, really seems so silly and pointless. How are young people supposed to resist the feed if they don't have information? And one of the things that our digital world offers them is a plethora of sites that actually do provide valuable information with a huge number of different voices that allow young people to pick and choose how they use digital culture to rethink the world. And I would like to put into your head now the notion of how different this is if you think about Greta Thunberg, who has been waging her environmental strike online, in person, in the books that she's writing, in speeches that she's giving. And I am going to assume that all of you know who Greta Thunberg is. Do you know who Autumn Peltier is? Autumn Peltier, who is an Indigenous teenager here, who is also part of that environmental movement. And if you were to go to David Suzuki's site, you would find a huge number of young people who are involved in the environmental movement and who are making a difference in how we think about the world. Why isn't that possible in M.T. Anderson's feed? Well, I argue that how the feed was devised and what it's for is very different. I don't know, says Titus, when they first had feeds, like maybe 50 or 100 years ago. Before that, they had to use their hands and their eyes. Computers were all outside the body. They carried them around outside of them in their hands, like if you carried your lungs in a briefcase and opened it to breathe. So the feed's developed so that you have the feed implanted in you, and not only does the feed provide you with information, but as we discover, much to our chagrin, it also takes over bodily functions too. At this point in our world, thank goodness, digital culture hasn't done that. And at this point, we're interacting with a type of feed, if we think of it in that way, a stream of constant information that is fed to us in ads that we see, banner ads, for example, or the ads that we see in Twitter or on Facebook or Instagram. All these ads that tell us about things that we want, that we should have, but also the other side of that is that we also have access to real information. It's now more now, says Titus, it's not so much about the educational stuff, but more regarding the fact that everything goes on the feed. All of the feedcasts and the instant news, that's on there. So there's all the entertainment I was missing without a feed, like the girls were missing their favorite feedcast, this show called Oh Wow Thing, which is all these kids like us who do things to get pouty, which is what girls go crazy for, the poutiness. But the braggest thing about the feed, the thing that made it really big, is that it knows everything you want and hope for sometime before you even know what those things are. It can tell you how to get them and help you make buying decisions that are hard. Everything we think and feel is taken in by the corporations, mainly by data ones like FeedLink and OnFeed and American Feedware, and they make a special profile that's keyed just to you, and then they give it to their branch companies or other companies to buy them, and they get to know what it is we need. So all you have to do is want something, and there's a chance that it will be yours. Well, that's great if you have money. But as we know, more than almost 30% of the American population don't have feeds. Some of those people in the American population, like Violet's father, have very old models of feeds, models in which you see almost a screen and on glasses. And there are different ways in the novel in which there is a possibility of contesting the power of the feed. Violet's father does it by using language that is antiquated and isn't that language that everyone seems to speak. But at the same time, can young people do anything else? What else do they have to go by? For example, at one point of the novel, the kids all buy what they call riot gear, named after different riots that took place in the United States. And Violet, given the type of character she is curious and wants to know if these people, these young people who she's interacting with, have any sense of the different riots that the clothes are supposed to be representing. Two of those riots, by the way, are really important. One is the Watts riots, which was a race riot, and the other is the Stonewall riots, which are the riots that sparked the LGBT movement in the United States, or one of the things that sparked the LGBT movement in the United States. But none of these kids know what these are. In fact, they really don't care. Titus makes it very clear that he's got no sense of history. He has no sense of the way that the world works. He doesn't even know that the United States is not a democracy. And he and Violet get into a fight about the fact that the United States is a republic, not a democracy. And what does that mean? One of the things it means is that when you vote, your voice isn't the same as in a democracy, because you elect people to vote for you, as Violet argues. So ultimately, there's a helplessness in feed that I'm not convinced is of value to contemporary kids. I think that contemporary kids are making incredible use of the feed. And if one of the things that we need to think about as adults in looking at the worlds of childhood is hearing children's voices, Yes, of course, there's all kinds of nonsense on the internet. I'm not for a minute suggesting that all young people use the internet in a positive, change-making way. There are all kinds of silly, stupid videos that you can have access to. I mean, just look at TikTok. But at the same time, there are pockets of resistance. There are ways to use that technology, that digital culture in new ways. And it isn't just happening elsewhere, it's happening here too. Just think about the way the young people responded to the teachers' strike that started last fall and continued into the spring, and the very strong voices that they had in contesting what our provincial government did, going so far as to actually win in court against the Ontario government. That's really different. That's really interesting. And one of my questions, if I could ask MT Anderson something now, is how would he approach digital culture? Because digital culture seems to be limited primarily to consumer goods and entertainment. Awful songs, terrible films and television shows. And it's not that our world is any different, but in the feed there is no room for really saying no. And I think in the lives of real children living right now, there is lots of space. In fact, one of the things that I think is the most interesting is how digital culture is incorporating young people into that space and allowing them to resist. Think about the way that digital culture in the last several months has worked to change our attitudes about race with the Black Lives Matters focus that so many of us have been active participants in one way or another. All digital. Look at the way that we've responded to COVID and how, even in isolation, we are finding ways to use the digital, the virtual world to make connections that I think otherwise would have been impossible for us to survive this pandemic. If you think about the feed, yes, of course, all of these young people have access to the same information. All of the information, though, is being relegated to creating specific profiles of who they are and what they buy. It's not about being an active participant in the world. It's about being used, about being taken over, about being modified. And even someone, a character who I think we admire, Violet, who is not always an easy character to deal with, but at the same time has a very clear sense of how problematic the feed is. Does Titus change in the course of the novel through his interactions with Violet? Yes and no. He certainly becomes aware of what she's talking about. And in that final scene between them, when he goes to visit her, she's in basically a comatose state, but he's feeding her little stories, little nuggets that he has pulled out of the feed and which he is offering to her as a type of restitution for his ignoring her earlier pleas. Maybe he is just a little bit more aware than he was earlier in the novel, particularly when they broke up and he's so angry with her because he doesn't really understand her. One of the things that is so clear is how the world of the feed is so very much geared to gender differences between male and females. I don't know how M.T. Anderson would have dealt with trans issues in this novel had they been as important as they are in our particular moment. But there's no space for that in Feed. As well, one of the things that really strikes me is how unaware the people in the novel are, other than, of course, Violet, about class differences. When Titus, in his fancy new up car, goes through the various level of the suburbs down to Violet's level, which is probably on the surface of the earth, and he talks about how run down it is. There's no sense of poverty. There's no sense of involvement. There's no sense of being able to access digital culture in a way that would let young people shape their own profiles. But that's not how it is in our world. That's not how it is in this particular moment. And I think one of the things that strikes me is that the world of Feed, yes, it's a fascinating dystopia, but how do we hear children's voices? And how different is children's real experiences of digital culture? In 1970 and in 2690, one of the things that the Children's Studies program used to focus on to some degree was the lives of Indigenous children. And some of you may know Shannon Kustashian, who was very involved in fighting for education, for equal education for Indigenous young people. A battle that Cindy Blackstock of the First Nations Family and Caring Society has been carrying on since then, and has taken to a human rights tribunal, which has found that the Canadian government is abnegating its responsibility to Indigenous young people. When Shannon Kustashian, who was a teenager herself, first became involved in this fight, she wanted to use the internet in order to make a difference, and she used whatever technology was available to her to make a video and to create a profile of how young people could get involved in fighting for equal rights for Indigenous youth. Where's that room in Feed? Is there room for that in Feed? It's a cracking good read. It's a novel that has very interesting ideas and offers us some fascinating ways of thinking about digital culture. But I'd have to say that the reality of digital culture and the way that young people can use digital culture now is so much more extraordinary. And how might M.T. Anderson rejig Feed if he was thinking about the way that young people use digital culture today? I just think about the way that I follow someone like Greta Thunberg almost on a daily basis. I look at her posts on Twitter. I look at what she posts on Instagram. I'm very aware of her presence. I'm aware of a number of other young people who are very politically motivated on both Twitter and Instagram, which are the two digital realms that I most interact with. One of the things that I think is different is that although we are often inundated by corporate culture, and corporate culture often does not care what we do because the bottom line is the dollar line, I think even corporate culture is beginning to see some differences. If you think about, for example, superhero movies, look at how various universes, the Marvel universe, for example, is about to change tremendously. There's going to be a female Thor. Captain America is going to be black. Who's the next Iron Man or Iron Person? these are things that are happening. And yes, of course, they're very small steps. But I think that young people can be more involved in consumer culture, and in particular, they're using digital culture in a way that I find quite fascinating. Do we hear the voice of the child in Feed? That's an interesting question to think about. You've spent some time looking at that document, and I know that Professor Gennaro talked about the fact that Canada was very much involved in writing the document and in ratifying the document. But I have to say that how Canada treats children is appalling. In particular, its record with Indigenous children meets the failing grade. How we think about the digital world and how things happen in that digital world now allow young people to be active participants in a way that I don't think M.T. Anderson ever imagined. I don't think Anderson ever looked beyond the way that digital culture represented consumer culture. And I agree, ads and the way that we're fed things in billboards and advertisements when we go to the movies, all of that is so deeply offensive and is shaping our lives in ways in which I often feel completely out of control. But at the same time, I think young people can find that voice if they use digital culture. And I think not only are they using digital culture, they are embracing digital culture, they are recreating digital culture, and they are making digital culture work for their agendas. Agendas that I think will make a difference as we move forward. I think what young people are doing on TikTok in fighting against the presidency of Donald Trump is magnificent. I think that what young people are doing in terms of fighting for our environment is unbelievable. And I think that young people really are, perhaps for the first time ever, truly the future, because we are hearing their voices, not just in the future when they become adults, but as children now. I think what they're doing is incredible. And I'm not sure that we see that in M.T. Anderson's Feed. Because it seems to me that using a phrase from television, from BBC's Doctor Who and the Daleks, resistance is futile. In the end, Violet dies, or is dying. And I'm not sure Titus really is capable of carrying her project forward. But I think that in the real world, young people are using digital culture in spectacular ways. I hope that I've helped you to think about what Anderson's doing. It is a fine novel, but it's also a novel of its time. It's a novel that speaks to a world that took these things for granted in terms of the limited access to digital culture that people had. I think that having smartphones and iPhones and iPads and having more access to digital technology has not been a bad thing, as Anderson might have thought it was in 2002 when this book was published. But I'm not sure how relevant Feed is to the lives of contemporary children now. I'd like to think that if he were to rewrite the book, the landscape of Feed would be very different. And I'm not sure that we'd see Violet in a coma at the end of the book. I think it would be more like one of the novels by Cory Doctorow, in which young people topple governments, not see governments crush them, not see consumer culture take over. I think that young people have invaluable things to say in the digital world, and I am listening. Thank you.